In the earliest days of Clint Eastwood's career, long before he became a household name, before the grit of the spaghetti westerns or the gravel of Dirty Harry, he was a young, ambitious unknown in the shadows of giants. He walked the board's corridors of Warner Brothers and Paramount with reverence, brushing past stars whose faces adorned billboards and magazine covers. To the world, they were gods, paragons of class, charisma, and American greatness. But Eastwood, with those piercing eyes and quiet demeanor, was always watching, and what he saw rattled him. He recalls with chilling clarity the first time he saw Errol Flynn, a man idolized for his daring roles and devil-may-care grin, scream at a young costume assistant until she wept uncontrollably. Flynn, drunk before noon, hurled insults. So cruel, Clint said the entire set froze, and no one said a word. That silence, Clint realized, was Hollywood's currency. Then there was George Cukor, the famed director behind classics like My Fair Lady, whose public persona as a cultured intellectual hid a razor-sharp temper and a controlling nature so severe that young actresses reportedly left his sets in tears, afraid to speak up. Clint, then a contract player under watchful eyes, couldn't intervene, but he never forgot. Even Spencer Tracy, long revered as one of Hollywood's finest actors, was not immune to Eastwood's scrutiny. Known for his brooding intensity, on screen, Clint witnessed moments of cruelty off camera, snide, belittling remarks to stagehands, deliberate isolation of younger co-stars he viewed as competition. "You'd think gods would act better than mortals," Clint once said, "but some of them were monsters playing angels." But it wasn't just arrogance, it was a kind of predatory entitlement. In Eastwood's first few years working studio, he began hearing whispers about Clark Gable, not about his talent, which was unmatched, but about his power. One assistant director allegedly warned Clint early on, "Stay out of Gable's way if he's with a girl. He doesn't like to be interrupted." The implication was clear, and Eastwood, young but not stupid, understood. Even Cary Grant, beloved for his gentlemanly charm, had a cold, calculating side that unsettled Clint when they met at a charity function. Clint was barely introduced before Grant turned and walked away mid-sentence, muttering that no names shouldn't talk. Business with stars. It wasn't the insult that stung. It was the ease with which it was delivered. These weren't just bad days or bitter moments. These were patterns. Clint began to understand that many of the legends the world adored were wearing masks, and underneath some were cruel, some corrupt, and a few, in his words, were evil through and through. The deeper Clint moved into Hollywood, the more of this ugliness he encountered. From shouting matches hidden behind studio doors to private parties where exploitation was normalized, he saw the machine that protected monsters as long as they turned box office gold. "They treated kindness like weakness," Clint once told a friend in confidence. "If you didn't play the game, they'd chew you up." But Clint played it differently. He stayed quiet, observant, deliberate, learning the rules while quietly collecting the names and faces of those who abused their fame. And though he never sought revenge, now, in the twilight of his life, he's finally ready to speak. The golden age wasn't just golden, it was gilded. Beneath the shine was rot, and Clint Eastwood saw it all. Clint Eastwood knew from the beginning that Hollywood was built on power, who had it, who wanted it, and who was willing to cross any line to keep it. As he rose through the ranks of the studio system in the 1950s, he began to see a sinister pattern emerge, one not covered in the gloss of movie magazines or fan club newsletters. It was the unspoken hierarchy of cruelty, where a chosen few at the top used fear, intimidation, and manipulation as tools to dominate those beneath them. The public knew them as beloved performers or visionary directors, but behind the scenes they operated more like mob bosses than artists. One of the earliest and most chilling figures Eastwood ever observed was Joan Crawford. To the outside world, she was a glamorous icon, sharp cheekbones, timeless poise, a survivor in a male-dominated industry. But Clint saw something else. He'd heard the rumors, of course, the icy behavior on set, the screaming fits behind closed doors. But what rattled him was her control over young actresses. Clint was once present during a casting session where Crawford, acting as a sort of unofficial gatekeeper, humiliated a trembling teenage actress by mocking her dress and appearance in front of an entire room. "You'll never make it with that." "Face," Crawford reportedly sneered. No one laughed, but no one stepped in either. Power, Clint realized, could turn even the most talented into tyrants. Then there was Otto Preminger, the Austrian-born director, known for his artistic brilliance and his brutal on-set methods. Clint didn't work with him directly, but friends warned him about the filmmaker's merciless treatment of actors, particularly women. Eastwood later confessed that hearing the horror stories of Preminger's cold, calculating way of breaking down performers made him vow never to treat actors as pawns in pursuit of perfection. "You don't destroy a person to get a performance," he once said. Another name that haunted Clint was Robert Mitchum. While fans adored his tough guy cool, Clint knew a different side, one marked by aggression and entitlement. At a rap party in the early 60s, Clint recalled seeing Mitchum drunkenly berate a female assistant director, slapping a drink out of her hand and snarling that women shouldn't give orders on a man's set. The room went silent, but the laughter returned a moment later. The kind of laughter born from fear, not humor. It wasn't just actors who wielded power dangerously. The studio heads themselves were often worse. Clint spoke cautiously, even in later years, about the men in the executive offices, moguls like Louis B. Mayer, the godfather of MGM, who was worshipped in public but feared in private. Mayer was known for crafting stars from thin air, but also for discarding them the moment they lost market value. Eastwood heard horror stories from actresses who were threatened, silenced, or loaned out as favors to other executives. "He didn't run a studio," Clint once remarked in private. "He ran a kingdom, and you didn't cross the king." And Mayer wasn't alone. The famed producer, Harry Cohn, who ran Columbia Pictures, was another ghost that haunted old sound stages. Clint was warned about him early on. Stories of how Cohn kept files on every actor and director in the business, using secrets like weapons. His presence lingered long after his death, like a specter of the era's moral decay. What disturbed Clint most wasn't the existence of these tyrants. It was how many people enabled them. Eastwood recalled crew members, assistants, even fellow actors who would look the other way, or worse, align themselves with cruelty in hopes of climbing the ladder. He learned quickly that standing up to power was dangerous, and that silence was a kind of currency in Hollywood. And perhaps the most unsettling realization? Some of the most evil behavior didn't happen in rage, but in calm calculation. Eastwood described a major male star, whose name he still hesitates to publicly confirm, who was known on set for his politeness, but who would deliberately sabotage younger actors behind the scenes, altering scripts, cutting lines, even spreading false rumors to keep them from succeeding. "He didn't scream," Clint once said. "He smiled, and made sure your career was over by the end of the week." That was the twisted genius of Hollywood's darkest figures. Their evil didn't look like a villain in a movie. It looked like a handshake, a contract, a compliment. For Clint Eastwood, this wasn't just about individual bad actors. It was about a system that rewarded the worst impulses of powerful people. It's why, even as he gained his own clout, Clint kept his circles small, his trust earned, not given. And why now, after decades of silence, he feels the weight of knowing and not saying. The ones who smiled the brightest, he says, were often hiding the darkest secrets. There's a kind of betrayal that cuts deeper than a punch or a threat, the quiet kind, the kind that happens behind closed doors, wrapped in smiles and handshakes. And in Clint Eastwood's experience, those were the kinds of betrayals that defined many of the so-called legends of the Golden Age. They were actors who played heroes on screen, noble cowboys, romantic leads, war veterans, and family. Men, but off-camera, their moral compasses were shattered. Clint remembers being stunned by how many of these stars built careers on false virtue. There was Bing Crosby, the iconic crooner whose Christmas songs and wholesome image masked a darker truth. Eastwood, who heard stories from crew and colleagues, later learned how Crosby's own children suffered under a father who was, by many accounts, emotionally distant, controlling, and even abusive. 1. Former co-star quietly told Clint that Crosby's family man persona was the biggest lie in Hollywood. And yet, year after year, he sold that image with a smile. Then there was Walter Brennan, an actor revered for his wise, grandfatherly roles in westerns and dramas, a man many viewers grew up trusting as a symbol of old-school decency. But Eastwood recalled how behind the scenes, Brennan was fiercely bigoted, outspoken in his hatred for civil rights movements, and unapologetic in his disdain for progressive change. Clint once overheard a heated conversation at a private dinner party, where Brennan dismissed a young black actor's rising popularity as a fad and swore he'd never share a screen with one of them. The room fell quiet. The young actor left early, and Brennan never apologized. For Eastwood, this was evil of a different kind, not loud or theatrical, but quiet, systemic, and deeply harmful. Even someone as beloved as James Stewart, the golden boy of American cinema, was not immune to hypocrisy. While Stewart was unquestionably talented and served honorably in WO2, Clint couldn't ignore how he used his squeaky clean image to distance himself from the darker parts of the industry, even when he knew the truth. Eastwood once said, "Some men hide behind their goodness, so they never have to confront their complicity." That stuck with him. Stewart wasn't cruel, but he turned a blind eye to it. And sometimes, that was just as dangerous. Another actor whose betrayal stayed with Eastwood for decades was Tyrone Power. Handsome, charming, adored by millions. But according to Clint and others, he was notorious for manipulating young actresses into relationships only to cast them aside once they were no longer useful to his career. Clint was warned early on never to trust Power's compliments. "If he praised your co-star," someone once told him, "that means she's in trouble." And then there was Loretta Young, a name that might surprise people. She was the epitome of grace and Catholic virtue on screen, a role model to women across America. But Eastwood was shocked when he learned about the hidden scandal involving her secret child with Clark Gable, and how she arranged to adopt her own daughter in a publicity cover-up orchestrated by the studio. The deception wasn't just tragic, it was institutional. Loretta's decision, likely shaped by the brutal pressures of the time, still struck Clint as a devastating example of how far stars would go to maintain an illusion. She protected her image, Clint once said, even if it meant erasing part of her own life. These weren't isolated stories. They were patterns of betrayal, of power used to manipulate, of truth buried beneath layers of cinematic perfection. Eastwood, who spent years trying to maintain his own integrity in the business, became more and more disillusioned with those who had built careers on lies. What disturbed him most was how Hollywood rewarded it, actors who were openly cruel behind. The scenes were honored, decorated, and held up as examples of greatness. Meanwhile, those who told the truth, or dared to speak out, were blacklisted, ridiculed, or quietly erased. Clint learned this the hard way when he defended a fellow actor in the late 1960s who had accused a studio head of sexual misconduct. The moment Eastwood backed him up in private, the phone calls stopped, invitations vanished, and producers started saying Clint was too political for certain roles. He backed off publicly, but the damage was done. That was the moment. "I realize silence keeps you working," he later admitted, "but it doesn't let you sleep at night." That kind of betrayal, of conscience, of principle, of truth, was the deepest scar the golden age left on Clint Eastwood. And now, as he reflects on those faces immortalized in celluloid, he's not thinking about their awards or their box office records. He's remembering what they were really like when the cameras stopped rolling. Some of them were brilliant, some were kind. But a few were evil because they knew the harm they caused and they kept doing it anyway. There's a quiet weight that Clint Eastwood carries now. Not the burden of regret, exactly, but the gravity of having known so much and said so little, for so long. He's always been a man of few words, a figure carved from stone and shadows, someone who let his work speak louder than his opinions. But as the years stretch behind him and the future narrows into legacy, Eastwood has begun to reflect not just on what he did, but what he allowed, and what he never dared to say. It wasn't about fear, he once murmured in an off-the-record conversation with a biographer. It was about survival. You say the wrong thing in that town and you're done. That silence, that complicity, wasn't unique to Eastwood. It was baked into the very foundation of Hollywood. As a young actor, he quickly learned the unspoken rules: don't expose, don't accuse, don't challenge the legends. You don't climb the ladder by calling out the man whose name is above yours on the poster. You keep your head down, you show up on time, and when someone says something awful or cruel or dangerous, you pretend you didn't hear it. Clint did that for years, not because he lacked the moral compass, but because he feared what telling the truth would cost him, his career, his credibility, maybe even his safety. There were moments when he nearly spoke out, like when a rising actress in the 1970s came to him in tears after being cornered in a producer's office. Clint wanted to confront the man, to take a stand. But instead, he told her to leave the studio and find safer ground. It was cowardice, he later admitted. I should have burned the place down. But even Eastwood, the no-nonsense cowboy, the vigilante cop, the outsider with a six-shooter and a moral code, understood that real Hollywood power didn't wear a villain's mask. It wore tuxedos. It smiled for the camera. It gave awards, and made calls that could build or bury you. And Clint had ambitions. He wanted to direct, to create, to last. So he played the game. He made alliances, he swallowed anger, and he kept a list in his head of the ones who crossed the line. People think evil is loud, Clint once said in a rare interview. But in Hollywood, it's polite. It laughs at parties. It shakes your hand and stabs you on the way out. Over the years, as others around him fell, to scandal, addiction, disgrace, Clint remained, not unscathed, but intact. And now, decades later, he's begun to realize that silence isn't always neutral. Sometimes it's part of the machine. In his twilight years, Clint has found himself talking more, not to the press, but to friends, to protégés, to young actors who still believe in the old dream. He tells them what he saw, the directors who ruined lives with a smirk, the actors who preached virtue while practicing violence, the icons who became icons because no one had the guts to challenge them. And more than anything, he warns them about the cost of silence. You can survive in this business by keeping your mouth shut, he tells them, but one day you'll wake up and wonder who you really protected and who you failed. That's why he's finally sharing these names. Not for revenge, not for scandal, but for history. Because too many of the men and women he watched climb to stardom were never held accountable. They died legends while their victims died forgotten. Clint doesn't expect to change the past, but he wants to tell the truth while there's still time. He wants the next generation of artists to know that greatness on screen doesn't mean greatness in life. That charisma is not character. That talent does not excuse evil. And maybe, just maybe, by breaking his silence now, he can free others from the weight of theirs. As he sits alone in his Carmel home, photos of old sets and long-gone friends surrounding him, Eastwood is not bitter. He is clear, unapologetically honest. The way only a man at the end of a long, legendary road can be. Some of them were heroes, he says. Some of them were villains, but the worst ones fooled everybody, until now.